Morning, Jeff.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Can you hear me all right? Hey, Jeff, you able to hear me?
Indeed.
Okay, good. All right. Looks like we got enough people. We'll go ahead and get started. Cool. Today is right sizing. So let's go ahead and get started. What is right sizing? Really, right sizing is about taking resources and maximizing the savings of that resource. So we, in compatibility, we identify unused or idle resources. We make a recommendation to turn them off, making them smaller, or outright deleting them. Right sizing recommendations are based off of utilization metrics. So this is different than cost metrics. Costing comes from that invoice. Utilization metrics come from actually monitoring individual resource maximums and minimums. So how much hard drive, how much RAM, how much CPU. So in compatibility, each vendor has a native way to track those resources and the utilization, but we also support a Datadog and New Relic. So those are additional third-party applications that customers can use and integrate with Cloudability, and those do track utilization metrics. Lastly, views based on tags, count groups, business mappings is fully supported. So when we get to the platform, you'll see that resources are 100%, or the resource page is able to be viewed. All right, so what sorts of cloud types do we support for right sizing? This is a snippet from what I created in the platform. Kind of the pedestrian terms on the left-hand side. You have compute, auto scaling, hard drives. So think of it as, you have a hard drive in your computer. Storage. So these are large blob or S3 type storages. And then database. So the reference under each one, AWS, they refer to their compute as EC2. Azure, it's just Azure Compute. That's a fancy name. Anyways, I'm not going to go through each one, but you can see we predominantly do support pretty much everything with AWS. As the quarters go on and the product team advances the products, we get more and more supported capabilities. For instance, just recently, Google Cloud Compute, GCP, we didn't support, for instance, our own recommendations. Now we do. So a couple of notes: spot instances are excluded for recommendations. It's because spot is a kind of a very quick use And there's no real right sizing per se. We do have a couple customers who ask for it. But when it is excluded from recommendations, and we don't offer that today. And also a couple other quick note is container namespace right sizing. You will see a tab today. We're not going to cover that today in today's session. We're going to cover that in the container session later. All right, a couple notes on right sizing recommendations on the defaults. By default, it is on demand and 10-day. We have cost total. So this is actually sorry, total spend is cost total. So that is without adjustments, without savings. So cost adjusted, cost amortized, not supported. So if a customer does ask to have a different metric referenced, we're not able to do that today. So it's always cost total for each of the vendors. Estimated right sizing savings, again, it's cost total if they delete or terminate the instance or hard drive. Right sizing savings, again, cost total of the right sizing and auto scale recommendations. So in right sizing, we do offer to say you should make this machine smaller, but we also say you should put this machine into an auto scale group. So it's always cost total again. And then estimated optimized spend is the cost total of the new right-sized instances. One thing to note in here is we don't have a way to save someone's settings per se. So if someone says, well, I don't want 10-day, I want 30-day, or I only want to always reference S3. What you can do is actually ask them to bookmark the URL. And you'll see each one of these kind of after the slashes, we see it's a set URL. So then they can reference it that way.
Hey, Kyle.
Yep.
So actually, I just want to interject here. Cost adjusted is supported if it's enabled, and we'll always use that if we have cost adjusted for all of these metrics and the details of the of any of the recommendations.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
Yep.
So when you say enabled.
So yeah, if cost adjusted is turned on, which is to say if the custom pricing tick box is checked in active admin, then we will use cost adjusted.
So would like the cost adjusted metric just supersede the like on demand cost, or would it supersede the effective cost?
So there's not really so for effective cost we would use cost adjusted amortized basically. It's a little more complicated than that, I would say, but that's my basic understanding. The point here is that when we're using cost adjusted, we have to do that because different services or different instances might have different discounts, which would affect our recommendations. Because our goal here is to make cost saving recommendations. So let's say you have an EBS volume and you're saving 20% on that EBS volume from your EDP. Well, if there's a different volume that normally would be a little bit more expensive, but you have a 50% discount on that somehow, well, then we would have to make that recommendation instead, because of your extra discount. So that's the kind of thing that cost adjusted allows for. If we don't have cost adjusted enabled, it's just going to use cost total, so completely ignorant of any discounts you might have.
So we're taking to an effect for the recommendations we're making as well, the cost adjusted, that's associated with the recommendation.
Yes, yeah. So we apply the pricing rules to any pricing tables that we have, and for Azure, this is true for Azure too, because we get the real cost from Azure. We don't have to worry about cost adjusted.
Good to know.
Definitely good to know. we'll want to research. I'll want to research that more as well. How we do that on the back end, so we can help.
Yep.
But they're good call out. I
Yeah,
appreciate
I've been looking deeply into recommendations, and it definitely is using cost adjusted. So
Cool. Excellent. Okay, so notes on right sizing. The total KPIs that you see in the screen are based off of the top recommendation. So you can have up to 5 recommendations per resource. So by default, it's going to show the top recommendation. There's a different behavior if you use the API, but we're not going to talk about that today. I just want to focus on the UI. Right sizing is ingested and processed once per day, so that there is a delay. No partial days are included for obvious reasons, right? If you have a partial day, it's not going to give you the best recommendation. For each vendor, both cost and utilization data are required to appear. So if there's a break or something happens with the cost side, it will affect the utilization side. So that's kind of a troubleshooting item. And then lastly, I know there's a lot of controversy about the last one. I did reference what we have from engineering. So if this needs to be modified, we can always go back to them. But idle for EC2 is time spent below 2%. So if you have a CPU usage and it's under 2%, then it's classified as idle. And it's on a scale of 1 to 100. And it's for EBS, it's percent hours with 0 IOPS. So it's kind of noticeable the difference there. The definition of idle is different for compute versus non-compute. So idle is based on IOPS for disk block storage, such as EBS, Azure Managed. Idle is based on the number of active DB connections at a given point on a relative database, such as RDS. All right. So let's take a look in platform. So again, by default, when I land on this page, you'll notice 10-day is selected, on demand is selected, and by default, it always goes to AWS EC2. So if you have a customer who comes in and it says, I'm not sure if any of these, I think I have recommendations for all these, but sometimes you'll end up with a notice that says, that please enable the credentials to enable this feature. If you see that, it's referencing AWS EC2, and you might have a customer who does, only Azure, for instance. Again, going back to it, I would just have them change the URL, because then when they land on it, they're not prompted with the wrong thing. All right, so if we go through each one of these, you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, we do have, the selections for the specific resources and types. You'll notice Redshift is in here, and it wasn't in my list for right sizing. Redshift today is more of an inventory tab. It's not, we don't offer recommendations on Redshift today. For cost basis, there's 2 in here, on demand and effective. So on demand, as I just learned actually today, was it's either on demand, so cost total, but if we have enabled the cost adjusted, it will be the cost adjusted. Effective will take into account reserved instances. So the thought is, if a machine is covered by a reserved instance, we probably shouldn't right size that machine. Obviously, the reason being is that if you take that machine and remove it from its specific type, you might lose the reserved instance savings. And the thought is reserved instance savings will be greater than what our recommendation would be. By default, it's going to select all accounts. So this is now an aggregate across all of the, whether it's a linked account or a sub project, etc. But you can drill into each individual account. Timeline is now representative of how a customer wants to represent this screen. So, customers who are very, very agile and constantly switching machine types and spinning up new resources, may side towards the 10-day. Reason being is that, we want a shorter window to be able to see into those resources and recommendations. On the flip side, customers who want more of a not so aggressive recommendation, something that's based off of more historical, we would recommend them using a 30-day window. So in terms of costs, you'll notice that it's just 10 days of usage of that machine. If I slip to 30, you'll notice these costs roughly go up by 3 times. Again, you might have machines that are included that are not included in 10-day and vice versa. So it's not always a direct multiplier. Sometimes people think, oh, well, it's just a direct multiplier, and it's not. It's actually changing the recommendations, but it's including 30 days of all the appropriate resources underneath. Filters, you can use these filters. I'm not going to go through that very much, but more importantly, views again are supported. So 2 different ways to be able to filter that data. And then lastly, a lot of customers ask us, can we modify this page? And the answer is no. But these are the defaults. But that said, if we do export the data, what we will see, what we will see is a lot more reference points. And in particular, if we go down to the end, you'll notice that we have the additional business mappings, tags, etc., that are not necessarily in the UI itself. All right, so now let's pivot into the recommendation itself. If I click on, say, this first one, as I mentioned, there's 5, and each one has an increasing, usually an increasing risk factor, but it's a combination of risk and savings. So if there's in this case, we see 100% savings, right? Which is great, obviously. But when you right size that much, typically you're going to end up with a higher risk. So you'll see that these risks do go up and down. Here you have a lower risk, so 0 yellow bars, but only 83% savings. So our recommended, though, is 99% of the time you will see 0 yellow bars, and then the savings is variable, right? It's going to be the biggest potential savings for that instance. So even though you have 100% savings with a higher risk, that's going to eliminate it from the recommended.
Well, I have a question. I'm less familiar with savings, but like 100% savings, what would that mean? $0 cost, or like?
Yeah, that's
It's being rounded up in this case. The T3 Nano is like so cheap that it's just being rounded up to 100%, I believe.
I think that was about to say, yeah.
Click on that recommendation, Kyle, and we'll see like the estimated new cost.
I clicked on it.
Oh, you did. Oh, yeah. So you did already. So estimated new cost is $3.30 compared to $2,148.
Yeah.
So very, very close to 100%, but not actually.
Very cool. Thanks.
And quick question, just so that I don't make any poor assumptions. When we're talking about risk, we use that word a lot in this context. We're talking about risk of service degradation or data loss, or like what is the risk if a customer asks what we mean by that?
Service degradation, I think, is a decent way to put it.
Okay.
So basically, you might not have the resources to do the same workload at the same capacity. So it might take longer, it might not. So that's part of the context that we're missing. And so we're just kind of assuming that it might be. Look for one that's like 0% idle if you can. Now here we go. So with a spike like that, there we go. what we're saying here is that we don't have enough CPU capacity to handle that spike anymore. And so, well, will that degrade performance significantly? We can't say for sure, but we can identify that it's a risk that it could. And so, if that spike only lasts for a minute and then goes back down, maybe it's an acceptable risk for you that performance would just be a little degraded during that minute or so period while it recovers. So that's just for the engineers to ultimately decide.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
Yep.
And on that same note, as here you see the recommendation, right, is the yellow line. The CPU max, as Jeff indicated, was, in this case for, just a blip. As you end up with more blue over the yellow line is when you're ending up with a higher risk. And there's a pretty good correlation between those two. As you have more blips above it, you're gonna end up with high risk. Terminate by default, though, will always have at least one yellow bar because even if this machine is not used at all, there is an inherent risk to obviously deleting resources.
Yep. There's only one exception with that with EBS that I'm aware of, but other than that, you'll always see one pip of risk at least.
Jeff, any other things on this?
So the details page I think is like super useful just in general, and just for verifying and vetting a recommendation, for understanding our thinking behind a recommendation. So if you're curious, like why we're recommending this, almost always this is going to explain it, right? We have a cheaper resource that can do the same job, and so we think you should move, right? That's what it almost always comes down to. Or we think we have a cheaper resource that can almost do the same job, and it might be worth your your time to do it anyway. And I just kind of want to reiterate, like we are trying to maximize cost savings. So we're not trying to maximize fit it as close as possible to the size of the workload. This is not a utilization focused right sizing. This is a utilization informed right sizing. So someone coming from an engineering background might think of it in the other way, where they're trying to fit the resource or fit the workload to the resource rather than optimize for cost.
Great. I think the other thing I'll point out here is, by default, we have certain parameters we're looking at. The tags are included is kind of, you can reference them up above or in the data export itself, as I mentioned. A lot of customers who are using this on a more grand scale typically are exporting these in some way or fashion. What that means is either number one, we do have a Jira integration. So for Jira SaaS, not Jira on-prem, kind of a main point there. But for customers who are either using this functionality where it creates a Jira ticket for the engineering on the customer side to follow up, or they're exporting this data and then using an internal dashboard or Jira creation. I see that a lot more. So that's then using the API, which includes those different additional parameters.
Actually, one more point I want to make about the details page. One question you'll often get is like, well, what goes into the recommendation? And I just want to kind of reiterate that what goes into the recommendation are these metrics that are in these charts, right? So you'll notice that we don't have disk, we don't have memory, but we do have, GPU, CPU, and network, right? So these are the metrics that we're considering when we're trying to fit an instance into a different instance. So if it's not here, we're not thinking about it. One other thing is, for memory and for GPU, when those metrics don't exist, so say we don't have any of those coming in, then we're going to assume that they're at 100% the whole time, right? Which is to say, by default, we will not recommend an instance that has a lower memory capacity. There are options to change that. So in the details page, there's a little filter by at the top right here. Yep. And so this gives us a little bit more control over how we want those recommendations to be made. So this might be useful, it might not. Yeah, there's a 5 pip risk, it's always nice. But and sometimes those will change the recommendations and sometimes not. Jeez.
Good call out. The other thing I've seen some gotchas in here where, a customer might say, well, you're not recommending this type of machine. And what we've seen is as, say, AWS, changes machine types, some machine types, say, historically only support spindle hard drives and not,
SSDs.
Thank you, SSDs.
Yeah.
And we won't recommend an SSD machine because the recommendations are something that a customer can action on without a huge amount of effort. So we're not going to recommend, hey, switch to this other machine, because they will potentially have to spin up that machine, create an image, restore that image. Like, it's a huge process. So recommendations by default are something that the customer can action on typically today. And it's a pretty quick resource. You go into the AWS console, you switch the machine type, and you're done. So, if a customer is saying, well, and this goes back to what Jeff was saying, is like, look, if they're not using, for instance, memory metrics, and there's not a recommended machine type up here, well, it could be that that machine doesn't have a minimum like RAM capacity. So, it's these gotchas that we have to really dig into when a customer does come to us and say, well, these aren't accurate. Well, they are accurate for what our use case is. And our use case is, easy manipulation and right sizing of machines. Another gotcha, and then Jeff actually pointed this out, when it comes to, so each one of these subtabs, by the way, very similar to the EC2. The only difference is these columns do change slightly. Like for EBS, we do have a state where it shows attached, unattached. Each one of them has kind of a different flavor of columns. In this case, this is where a customer can come in and see, okay, this is actually unattached hard drive, meaning for whatever reason, there was a machine attached to this hard drive and now it's not. And so now it's just floating out there. And Jeff's point earlier is, this is the one caveat, there's no risk that we will say.
Yep.
Because if it's just unattached, hypothetically it's not doing anything, and you can easily delete it and save the $192 per month. Jeff, any other? I don't want to like drill into each individual one. But
Yeah. Really these principles apply to all the different services. So I would just keep those in mind, right? Make use of the details panel, try to understand those individual metrics, and really what they represent, and that will help you speak to the recommendations better. And as new resources come out, we will have to update our thinking. And as new services come out, we'll have to update our thinking. So just be flexible. learn the new stuff as it comes. You'll be okay.
Cool. I'll touch on the right sizing ROI real quick, and then we got some kind of Q&A.
Yep.
So on this Jira software integration, okay. So what this means is the customer has come in, they've configured the Jira integration, Jira SaaS integration. So again, they can come in here, they create an issue, which sends this off to Jira SaaS as a ticket. So then an end user / engineer will pick that up, make a conscious decision of whether or not to action on that. And then there's a feedback loop. So, once it's closed, that resource then will end up in right-sizing ROI. So what this feature enables us to do for customers who do have Jira SaaS is be able to monitor what the right-sizing savings have been actioned on. Here, you still see a potential, which means this is a demo environment. But the reason being is, there's a bunch of resources in here that a ticket was created, and you can see like where is the status of that ticket. Really cool feature. I've seen great use of this for some customers. Others either don't have Jira SaaS or they only have Jira on-prem, or obviously it's not being actioned for whatever reason. All right, let's take a look. All right, some Q&A here. Why does right-sizing show terminate or right-size recommendations, for instance, that have already been terminated a day or two ago? Jeff?
Well, basically, we have to wait until there's not any cost data left to stop showing that resource. So it's going to hang around for a while.
Yep. So if I have a 10-day terminate recommendation, how many days can I terminate that instance? How long will it take for that terminate recommendation to disappear?
I'd say 10 days.
There you go. All right. Do Cloudability right-sizing recommendations ever recommend increasing an instance size? Anybody on the call?
I'm going to guess no.
It's a good answer. The asterisk to this one is that we won't recommend increasing an instance size. We're not a scale up, we're a scale down. However, some of our recommendations will have an increased capacity due to new machine types.
Right. The thing to reiterate here is that we're looking for cost savings that can do the same job. So if there's another instance that has more capacity but can do the same job, we will recommend it, not because it has more capacity, just because it saves money.
All right, why aren't resource names shown for AWS resources when they have names visible in AWS console? So I'll take this one, even though I wrote it.
Yeah, please do. I wish I knew.
So this is a troubleshooting that we've seen every once in a while. When a customer is enabling the cost and usage report, they have to click, there's a little checkbox that says include resource ID in the invoice, in the CUR. So if that's not enabled, there's no way to link this to the CUR. So so this actually, it doesn't have to do with right sizing utilization data, like that might be working completely fine. It all has to do with the CUR and is that resource ID enabled. So in order to fix this, a customer actually has to go back into the console and they have to create a new CUR export because the original, you can't edit this for the resource ID. So they actually have to create a brand new CUR and then reconfigure that in Cloudability. All right, how long do customers need to wait before recommendations show? Or I should say, there's two questions to this one. How long does it take? Typically, but how long do we recommend before submitting a support ticket?
So cloudability only requires 1 hour worth of data to make a recommendation. So basically, as soon as we get data for the instance, it's possible, or the resource, it's possible it could show up, you know, if there's a recommendation to be made. That said, you know, I don't always experience that. You know, sometimes it takes a few days for it to actually show up.
Yeah. So just for everyone knows, if a customer enables this, say on Monday, our recommendation by support is please wait 48 hours. Don't submit support tickets. Like there's nothing we can do to make this data pipeline move faster.
You know, there's one other point to be made here, which is that right sizing is not an inventory. And so just because you've spun up a resource doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to have a recommendation for it. You know, if we don't have any recommendation for a lot of services, it's just not going to show up at all. Sometimes they'll show up with no action. You know, if we think it's underutilized, but there's no, you know, cost saving recommendation to be made. But in general, you know, if a resource is really well used, then we're not going to, it's just not going to show up in the list.
Yeah, and that's something I glazed over in a hot second earlier, was that, you know, a customer might say to us, like, I have more than $10,000 of EC2 spend.
Yep.
And I'm sure they do, because to just point, like, you know, if they have 100,000 resources, we're not going to show all 100,000 resources in here. So, you know, this is the total spend of the recommended list below. So if I take the cost savings, add all these together, I'm going to end up with the $10,000.
Right. And you can see that really clearly, like if you add filters. So like if we were to filter on a specific instance, then we would only see the numbers for that instance. Yep. So that's a good way to prove out that the KPIs at the top are just showing, you know, it's just what's in the list.
Good call, Joe. All right, last question of the day. How does AWS Databricks work with right sizing? This is a little bit of a trick one. It's not supported.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
So, you know, to our point earlier, you know, the easiest way, obviously, to see, do we offer, you know, the right sizing recommendations, is to come in and look here. Redshift is the one that it's just added for an inventory purpose today. But, you know, if I come back and look at kind of this grid, there we go. You know, this grid, like this is ever changing. You know, when I started, we didn't have Azure and GCP at all. You know, so maybe that dates me, but you know, we've come a long ways for sure, and this proves that, you know, our product team's doing a great job. And as new products are added, we just, you know, this list will grow. So the point of that last question was just, you know, sometimes, you know, we had a customer or two come to us, and for whatever reason they thought that, you know, they would have every service supported in AWS. You know, which AWS offers a lot more right sizing recommendations than Cloudability does. And so, sorry, as a result, you know, some of our customers think that we will offer the same thing. And the case is, you know, we just offer what we can today. All right, any additional questions? All right, well, thanks all. Have a great weekend, and we'll get this posted to SharePoint shortly.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.